this is the, I guess if I can pick the right word, the exhortation section of Paul's writings, hortatorical or whatever term you might want to use. Anyway, this is just kind of a collection of independent thoughts. But anyway, Brother Harkrider kind of approaches this as being connected, especially in verses from verse 7 through 9. So if you have your book, those of you who do, there probably are some who don't have. We have to find out about that before we get on into. He breaks this study down, into two sections. The first being the God of peace will be with those who guard their thoughts, or who pay attention to what they meditate upon, which we'll get to in just a minute or so here. But then he deals with that, and he connects that with verse 7, which said, the God of peace, or rather he says, the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And so there Paul has said, God has provided you a sentry. He's provided you a sentinel, someone who's standing guard. And with all of the fear, the anxiety, the unsettled conditions, the pulling to the right and to the left, and all these things that are stirring around, the storm that's raging in your inner being, God has provided you a sentry or a sentinel to stand guard over that and to relieve your fears and to alleviate your concerns and all that. So Brother Harkrider is connecting verse 7 with everything through verse 9. So although the lesson starts with verse 8, so that's the first section, and then we'll go through some of those things about the right thinking. And then the second part of the outline is a change of subject, and Paul is going through his appreciation, his gratitude again to the Philippians for their fellowship and for their concern for him. So we'll see how far we get with that. So I think in view of that, we'll read just verses 8 and 9 rather than that, and then we'll get to the other verses later. But I'll read from the New King James. I think several of you use that. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue and if there is anything praiseworthy, and heard and saw in me, these do, and the God of peace will be with you. And then I just wanted to read one other translation. Most of us don't hear much about the New Revised Standard Version. It tends to be, I guess, to be more common in other parts of the world than the United States, and kind of common in the academic world. But anyway, the NRSV, finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. And it varies from translation to translation because of all these terms that are used here. And so, Brother Harkrider treats that. We can, I guess, just follow his comments. You may or may not agree exactly depending on the translation you're reading, but whatever things, first of all, when he says whatever, what Paul probably is saying, anything and everything, you know, that fall into this particular description or reference or category of true or truth, honorable, pure, just. You know, these are the categories, so to speak, or the descriptions that are somewhat specifically, but at the same time comprehensive in their meaning and application, so that they don't really nail it down to just one thing. So he's saying anything that is true fits in that category, everything. And so that seems to be the idea of whatever. Now, as to why he repeats it 6 times, it's anyone's guess. I suppose it probably is, it's kind of an attention getter. Gives kind of a rhythm and repetition to it. So whatever is true, whatever is honorable, just, and so forth. Brother Harkrider says, for true, on page 54, this refers to thinking about things in reference to speech and conduct and motive, not just speaking the truth. Of course, speaking the truth and the truth revealed in the Scripture, all that is important, but it's apparently a little broader than that here. Must be, he says, a Christian must be true to God, to himself, and to others. In all of his endeavors and relationships, he is a person of moral character that is dependable. Some interpreters read this list of 6 things, or 8 things if you count all 8 listings. This list of 6 things and say, okay, that's 6 different things. We look at each one and try to identify it and relate to it. Others read this and say, well, Paul is trying to pair these off, and so they would suggest then that possibly things that are true and things that are honorable should be paired together. That's 2, and then the things that are just and the things that are pure should be paired together. That's 2 more. Things that are pleasing, or what was the other word that was used there? That was the New Revised Standard. What was it? That's the last thing, yes, of good report. Yeah, things that are lovely or lovable or pleasing. So anyway, we'll get a little more to that. But anyway, some think that Paul deliberately presents these in pairs, and then he gives the summation as a pair of things later on. But you can think about that.
If they're thinking that they're doing too much thinking, sounds like intellectuals to me. The fact is that you don't have to pair any of this. You don't have to.
No.
It's really simple. If something's true, if something's honest, or it doesn't matter if it's both.
Yeah.
You don't have to pair this. It's just simply saying that look at the things that are around you, the things that you're doing. Do they fit into any one of these categories?
Right.
And if you look at them overall, what he's talking about is this a spiritual thing?
Yeah.
Is it something scriptural? Is it something spiritual? Is it for the betterment of God's kingdom?
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's the thing. You have to look at it kind of as a whole. You look at it specifically, each one, but trying to pair them or anything like that, no.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit arbitrary and kind of a lot of conjecture.
Again, that's overthinking.
Right.
Too much of that.
It's just that Paul gives lists, so to speak, more than any other New Testament writer. Generally, when we have a list such as the works of the flesh or the fruit of the Spirit, or what we call the Christian graces in 2 Peter chapter 1, typically we think, at least for thinking and study, maybe sometimes we spend too much time on one thing trying to define it. in great detail, but typically we just take them and go down the list, don't we? And so that probably is the best way to think of it. Linsky in his comments was saying that he felt that folks were a little bit ambitious in what you just described there, but at the same time, he kind of objected to just saying that here's a list of 7 different kinds of things. He said he was saying he thought there was one kind of thinking that's described here, and that's the good and wholesome and godly thinking, and that it's 6 different ways to say the same thing. But anyway, we won't worry too much about that. So things that are true, that is true is probably a pretty general and comprehensive term, and maybe a little broader than some of the others, and maybe that's the reason it's first. I don't know. But anyway, it reflects what's factual or real. Can mean loyalty, can mean something that's genuine, and it's as opposed to something that's false or deceptive or based on illusion with an I. And so this may kind of be a foundational or beginning point. Something that is honest or honorable. Most of the translations, except the King James, use honorable there, and that's something that's seemly or proper, venerable. It's probably kind of close to the idea of something being sacred or sacrosanct. We say that there are certain ideas, certain beliefs, certain traditions or customs, certain things that are just naturally considered to be exalted or raised. We talk about our dealing with society and which apparently Paul has in mind here, trying to help the Philippians adjust to their environment in Philippi. But there are some things that are kind of sacred. It may be similar to the idea of the dignity and the worth and the value of every person. We really shouldn't toy with that, should we? Everyone who is a creature of God, made in the image of God, deserves honor and respect. And then there are certain things that we think and certain things that we do, decisions that we make that should be made on the basis of that honor. Something that's just, that we think about, meditate upon. Just basically has the idea of fairness or fair treatment. I believe Brother Harkrider had referenced the golden rule, as we call it, in Matthew chapter 7. But there's a lot of fraud, a lot of manipulation, a lot of unjust and unfair treatment of people in their dealings with others. And Paul seems to be saying, think, meditate, dwell, or ponder, these kind of things that are just. Thoughts or attitudes that are pure, chaste. It may be worded differently there in various translations, but the idea of purity, even in the pagan world, with all of its corruption and its idolatry and misconceptions about what was right and wrong, there was a belief among many of the pagans that life itself and the experience of life is kind of like preparing something for a sacrifice to, quote, a god or to their gods. And so that seems to be the word that Paul used here, that think on things that are so spotless and undefiled that they could be presented as an offering to God. And that's a good thought. Whatever is lovely or lovable, things that are just naturally or universally accepted, that everybody knows are pleasant and pleasing and admired, desirable. whatever is good report or good. What did King James say there? Of good repute, I believe, of good repute or of good report. Commendable, having a good name. That would especially apply to, our speech, to being gracious in our behavior and so forth. That would bring a good name to us, but would be recognized by good God-fearing people. If there's, so that's the sixth thing, and then Paul seems to say, in connection with what I've just said to you or taught you about these six things, to control your thoughts and your meditations, and that of course controls your actions and your decisions and your motives and so forth. If there's anything, he could have said, if there's anything else that is considered to be virtuous or excellent. We talked about excellent a little bit back in chapter 1. I guess we won't go back there again, but that you may prove or approve those things that are excellent. The word excellent usually means identifying something that is superior or that it's of highest grade. And the way it was used, if a soldier was especially diligent and zealous at his occupation, then he was excellent in his grade. He was an excellent soldier. If a piece of land was especially premium and valuable and of high quality, it would be excellent. If a particular field was especially productive, it would be an excellent field, and the same for an animal. And so Paul is just using a common word here when he talks about something that's virtuous or excellent. And he says, think about those kinds of good things. And then finally, if there's anything that is praiseworthy or worthy of praise, think on that also. If anything other than what he had already named. Praiseworthy could mean, I guess, a couple of things. It could mean that the thought itself, the very idea or the circumstance would be praiseworthy in itself. It could mean that it's something that would bring praise to the thinker, although it's not the objective of us as thinkers or as meditators, so to speak, to bring praise to ourselves. But I guess it doesn't really matter which it means there, but primarily it's something that's worthy of praise. So I guess there's probably some finer details on some of those, but if anyone has a comment or a question, we'll be glad to hear it. Okay, well that's mainly verse 8. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. 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 Okay, good. Good comment. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Phelan. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think probably Brother Harkrider is accurate in connecting, these three verses all together. Even if is some independence or separateness in some of these thoughts from verses 4 through 9, those 6 verses. But anyway, that's basically verse 8. It's a familiar verse. Again, it's kind of like the "Be not anxious" verse. Verse 6, I guess. We see it on wall plaques and greeting cards and various places. It shows up, and some of us probably have, even with the list of 6 or 8 things, you may have memorized it or you may not have. But anyway, it's a really familiar and helpful and practical verse of Scripture. If nothing else, we should at least, kind of mark it or remember where it is. But then in verse 9, Paul calls attention once again to his own example. And as we said when he mentioned this before in the latter part of chapter 3, Paul wasn't just displaying his ego, was he? He wasn't. So, I'm a great apostle, and so therefore you can follow me. But it was because he had such a good rapport, so to speak, or a good relationship with the Philippians, that he knew that they would not think that he was being selfish if he said to them, "I want you to join together and follow my example." And so now he seems here again to be maybe giving a gentle reminder to the Philippians. I was there and taught you. You heard that, or you learned that, and you received that. That is, you learned it intellectually, and in your mind you understood it. You received it as the truth and had a determination to put it into practice, and apparently he's saying you have done that. And then he said, you have heard and seen this in me. They heard it from Paul when he preached it, or when he taught it, or when they heard it indirectly from Paul, and they had seen that in his example. And so you learned it and received it. You heard it and saw it in him. And so those things that you learned and received, heard and seen, this do, the King James says. Put this into practice. I think that other translation we read said, keep on doing this. So that seems to be the idea. There's, Paul has been big on abounding in love, conducting yourselves in a way that's worthy of the gospel of Christ, standing firm one by the other in the cause of Christ, of spiritual maturity and spiritual stability, and growing and getting stronger and stronger. And so he says, keep on practicing this, keep on what you're doing. So it's, even though he's asking them to do something, it's kind of a commendation at the same time, isn't it? You're doing this, so keep on doing this. And the promise is the God of peace will be with you. Now back in verse 7, he said the peace of God which surpasses all comprehension will guard your hearts and lives in Christ Jesus. That is, God has sent you, again, we'll repeat, God has given you a sentry or a sentinel to stand guard for you, to protect you and to alleviate your anxieties and fears. And so there, the peace of God is kind of personified, isn't it? You get the picture of a sentry standing guard at his post. And then here he just reminds them that the peace of God comes from the God of peace as the source. So what the word peace is used a lot of different ways in the Bible. Basically, how do you think it's used here? Anyone? Well, of course, we're always aware that peace describes the reconciliation of the believer with God through Christ, aren't we? So it has that meaning. It can mean the absence of war in a tangible, literal sense, but here it apparently refers to that inner peace, as Brother Harkrider earlier, I think, described it. The serenity, the calmness, the poise, and the composure, all those sorts of things that are possible if we but look to the God of peace.
I think here it talks about peace, inner peace, as you said,
Mm-hmm.
but being content in your situation, no matter how bad the situation
Right.
is. If you trust in God, you have peace with what.
Yeah, I think you're right on that because we're getting to that, aren't we? Okay, well, anyone? Let's go on to, now verse 10 starts kind of a new thought there. We probably won't get too far with this, but Paul says in verse 10, notice a paragraph marking, but I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstance I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. And then I'll go ahead and read verse 14. Nevertheless, you've done well to share with me in my affliction. So Paul has talked a lot about rejoicing. This is about the seventh or eighth time that he's mentioned it in the Philippian letter in one way or another. Why did he rejoice greatly in the Lord in this particular instance that he brings up? Because of, yes, for their care for him. At last you've revived your concern. And it sounds a little awkward in English, but he's not saying, oh, at last, is he? Finally. But he's saying, at this later time, you've revived your care for me. Now, the earlier time was referred to before, back in the first chapter of Philippians. Paul was thankful that in view of your participation in the gospel from the first day until now, so in years before, and then later in chapter 4 he says, once and again, even in Thessalonica, you sent to my necessities. So they had sent to Paul's need at time or times in the past, but there had been a lapse of time, and he's not saying, well, the relief finally got here, and I'm not hungry anymore. In fact, he goes on to explain that's not what I'm saying. So he rejoiced that it was that their concern was their motive, their love for Paul, and it wasn't the actual gift itself that caused him to rejoice. He was happy apparently to receive it, but that wasn't the main purpose. But yes. Yeah, I believe that reference you pointed to was in 2 Corinthians about first giving yourself to the Lord. Yeah, in 2 Corinthians in connection with the collection. Yeah, they had given themselves to the Lord, and now they were helping Paul in his situation. Anyone? Any other comment on that? He says that you actually, I mean, this is paraphrasing, you actually had concern before, but they lacked opportunity. What does that mean? They lacked opportunity. It wasn't they lacked the will or the intention. We don't know exactly what the nature of this lacking was, do we? Brother Harkrider says, well, maybe they just didn't have the funds, or they hadn't been able to get the funds together at that time, or maybe they hadn't been able to work out the logistics. We just don't know. But in some sense, they had lacked opportunity. They weren't able to work out the details, and at this time they had, of course, by the sending of Epaphroditus. Now, from this point on, it's just, I think, to read and enjoy. And we'll just go over it again. Verse 11, not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. In the good times and bad, in prosperity and adversity, when times were lean and when times were full, Paul says, I learned to be content. I think most of the translations there say, I learned the secret. I'm not sure what the King James said. I think the original King James, if I'm not mistaken, and I forgot to check it, but I think it possibly says, I have been instructed. Does anyone know for sure or have that? That would be in verse 11. I'm sorry, in verse 12. Where I've learned the secret, it says in New American Standard. Does the King James there say, I've been instructed? Which? I've learned to be full. Oh, he says, I've been instructed? Okay. Yeah, and that I kind of like that because he's saying, well, what is that old cliche? Experience is the best teacher. And Paul said, from my experience, I've been instructed. I've learned something. And so what does that tell you about, the good times and the hard times and all the difficulties and being able to cope and adapt and adjust? Again, as we said last week, can you flip a switch and read the verse and walk out the door and say, well, okay, Paul says, be content, so I'm content now. Is that the way it works? It takes a little time and effort, doesn't it? And, as with worry. But anyway, verse 12, he'd learned to be content, whether it was hunger or fullness, lack or abundance. And then I think verse 13 probably is the summary of what he's been saying there. As simple as it is, what he has found is I can do all things through him who strengthens me. I think, again, the King James says I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. It probably should read him rather than Christ, but it apparently refers to Christ. And so anyway, having thanked them in the early part of the letter in chapter 1, and having expressed his gratitude and appreciation here in chapter 4 as he's beginning to close out the letter, and with these things having been said, he said, well, nevertheless, whatever the case, regardless of the details and all of my experience, what does he say about them in verse 14? Yeah, you've done well to share with my affliction. You've done a good thing. He's saying again, Paul didn't want to close this letter, this being probably the primary purpose of the letter was to show them his appreciation. He didn't want to close it without saying again, I'm grateful for what you did for me. And he was grateful because he saw it as their sharing in the gospel and in the grace of God. Was that the first or second bell? Okay. Well, we'll probably try to just start with the questions next week, and then we'll go into the next lesson. Thanks for all the comments.